A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today at the ISIS Election Watch webinar series titled Do Roti, Kapada and Makaan Matter? Today's discussion webinar will be centered around the place of economics and welfare in the upcoming general elections in India. Today, we are delighted to have with us the following speakers. Professor Louise Tillin, Professor of Politics at King's India Institute, Professor Rajeshwari Deshpande, Professor of Politics at Savitribai Phule Pune University, and Professor Indrajit Joy, Professor of Global Development Politics, University of York. Today's session is chaired by Diego Maurano, Senior Assistant Professor at the University of Naples and Visiting Research Fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. Today's session will be live streamed on the ISAS Facebook page. I shall now invite Diego Maurano to commence the discussion.
Thank you, and welcome everybody to this appointment with a series of webinars that ISAS is dedicating to the upcoming Indian elections. Today's session is dedicated to bread and butter issues, we could say. The title is, of course, taken from a very famous film from the 70s, which in turn was popularized by Indira Gandhi in the late 1960s for the 1967 elections, where she, of course, wanted to highlight how bread or food, clothes, and shelter were the most important things in a very impoverished country. And since then, and especially since the 1971 election with the very famous Garibi Hatao slogan, let's get rid of poverty, poverty has been at the center of at least an electoral slogan ever since. And since the early 2000s, also at the center of a concerted effort to tackle the most terrible forms of deprivations. India's welfare state has expanded substantially since 2004 at least, and has gone through a number of transformations since Modi took over in 2014. The welfare expanded, the welfare state has been expanded and also transformed, centralized, digitized, and has been made a central electoral platform for Narendra Modi and the BJP. So today, I guess the question that, at least to my mind, is more important is if all of these matter to determine electoral outcome. I am somehow skeptical that the issue is very relevant in determining electoral outcomes. It's more, in my view, part of a package, of a prime minister package, if you like, which has many aspects, and this is one of them. But per se, I think that electoral economic performance and delivery welfare is not something that really changes people's mind. But this might just be me, and I look forward to hearing what our three very distinguished speakers have to say. And I would go in the order of the flyer. So I would hand over now to Louise Tillin, Director of the India Institute at King's College London, for a brief introductory remarks. Each speaker will have 15 minutes, and then we will go through a second round of comments by the three speakers. And in the meantime, the audience is very welcome to put their questions in the chat, and I will select a few of them in order and ask them to the speakers. So please, Louise, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Diego, and to ISAS for inviting me to take part in this webinar on such an important and I think puzzling question. And let me start my remarks by setting out what I think the puzzle is for all of us. We hear a lot of noise in the international pink papers, the financial press, about very positive economic news from India. India is regarded as, a bright spot in an otherwise somewhat faltering global economy, or at least from the perspective of London, a faltering European and British economy. However, there have been growing signs of considerable economic distress for very many Indian citizens, especially as a result of high levels of unemployment, rising prices, and very high levels and rising levels of inequality. And thus, as Diego has said in his opening remarks, it is perhaps somewhat puzzling that these questions of economic distress don't find their way more clearly into shaping the way that people vote. So I wanted in my remarks to set the scene a little bit, firstly by looking at how much we know about voters' concerns about these bread and butter issues, then to look at how these bread and butter issues shape what's on offer politically, so what political parties are pledging or campaigning on with regards to the economy and welfare programs, and then to look at the puzzle as to why these things may not find their way into shaping how people vote in quite the way we might imagine. And I'll try and do all of that in the 12 to 15 minutes that I've been allotted here. But Diego, please let me know if I'm talking for too long. So I think I wanted to start by highlighting some of the most recent opinion survey data published last week by Logniti CSDS, who are India's premier election survey research organization. And that pre-poll survey, which I'm sure other speakers may also speak to today, showed us that voters do care very much about bread and butter issues, and that unemployment and price rises particularly are key concerns. Indeed, I think it's striking to compare this 2024 pre-poll data with the equivalent survey data from 2019, in which unemployment and price rise are much more prominent concerns today compared to 2019. So this year, half of voters mention unemployment and price rise as the key election issues, compared to only 1 in 6 voters in 2019. Other data shows that while 48% of voters say that their quality of life has improved over the last 5 years, a pretty substantial proportion of voters, 35%, say that it has got worse, with only 1 in 5 people saying that in their current economic situation, they are able to fulfill their needs and to save. And when we look at the class breakdown, we see that those from poor and lower class backgrounds are considerably less likely to say that the Achhe Din, the so-called good times, the good days that Narendra Modi had promised in his first national election campaign in 2014, those from poor and lower classes are considerably less likely to say that those Achhe Din have arrived for people like them. So I think there's clear evidence in that voter survey data to suggest that these issues are on people's minds as they go into the current election season. Added to that, we've seen a new report in the last few weeks for the World Inequality Lab by Thomas Piketty and his co-authors, which shows that inequality in India, measured as the level of income concentration, is currently at its highest level since 1922. So its highest level for 100 years. And their work shows that the top 1% of India's population account for 23% of all income and 40% of all wealth. And in that situation, as the authors of that report write, it is unclear how long such inequality levels can sustain without major social and political upheaval. So given these two things, that we know voters care about livelihood issues and that inequality is rising and consolidating very fast, why don't these questions matter more in how people vote? I would say the answer to this is a function of both the kind of supply side and the demand side of politics. So it's a question both of what political parties offer or pledge to voters and how they frame the electoral contest. And it's also a question of how voters interpret the political offer and utilise their vote. So let me turn to the supply side first. Welfare policies, which are increasingly labelled guarantees. If you look at the BJP manifesto that was published earlier this week, it takes the format of a series of guarantees, Modi ki guarantee, and this has poached language that the Congress Party utilised first in the state elections in Assam and then in Karnataka and then in Rajasthan to foreground a set of their own welfare policies. So the language of welfare policies labelled as welfare guarantees is now fairly ubiquitous in the manifestos of both national parties and of state parties. Some authors, such as Ratin Roy and Yamini Iyer, have described this as the consolidation of a compensatory form of welfarism in an economy which is failing to provide secure employment to a large proportion of its citizens. And we saw welfare really take centre stage for the first time, at least in the BJP's manifesto in 2019. In fact, in 2014, the BJP had come to power on a platform which had promised to move beyond or away from a culture of welfare entitlements and to generate growth and jobs and economic opportunity. But very quickly after coming into office, the BJP fell back onto a more conventional welfarist platform, if you like, even though, as Diego mentioned at the beginning, the nature of welfare schemes has changed a lot in the BJP era towards a much more digitized direct welfare, direct benefit transfer model than the rights-based era which had preceded it. Now, I think in 2024 compared to 2019, in some ways, welfare has become more baked in. So I would say it's a less prominent part of the BJP's election platform in some ways than it was in 2019. The BJP's flagship welfare policies that were introduced in their first term, so thinking about things like Swachh Bharat for sanitation, the Ujjwala Yojana for cooking gas, the PM Awas Yojana, the housing scheme, these are now, they've become almost kind of quotidian. They're there, but they're not at the forefront of the election campaign, in contrast to 2019 when the schemes were newer. I think food subsidies under the rebranded public distribution system, the PM Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana, these subsidies were expanded during COVID-19, and those expanded subsidies have been maintained. These get a much more prominent billing in the BJP's manifesto, and I think they've become, in some parts of India, probably not all parts of India, an increasingly important part of the way that the party is maintaining a connect with what some observers describe as the labhati, the beneficiary class. And food rations now have extremely wide reach. By some accounts, over 70% of India's population are accessing food subsidies through this scheme. So these are important. They feature prominently in the work that grassroots activists and party workers do. But whether they're decisive in election outcomes is another question. And let me move on then to this puzzle as to why there might be a disconnect between the livelihood concerns that voters feel, the prominence of welfare programs in party platforms, and then the decisions that people make about how to vote. So let me move on to that. I think there are a number of possible reasons why we see this disconnect. Firstly, and arguably most importantly, voters are primed to focus on other things at election time, especially, of course, their identity, their religion, and their caste. And in this campaign, even more so than previous campaigns, hyper-nationalist issues such as the Ram Mandir, the abrogation of Article 370, and a new crusade against corruption are being placed, by the BJP at least, at the forefront of this election campaign. The form of populism that has been honed by the current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, offers voters in the majority Hindu community a simple set of explanations of the forces that stand in the way of their advance. So if you like, it's a shorthand explanation for the kinds of frustrations that they experience in their everyday life. Populism is defined against a corrupt cosmopolitan elite associated with the Congress and other opposition parties. And this kind of populism has overshadowed performance-based voting. Voting based on performance evaluations that voters might have of the economy or of their own personal situation. And this has really, turned the tide in an electoral context in which there was growing evidence before 2014 that performance voting was starting to matter more in explaining election outcomes in India. So a form of right-wing populism, which we've seen in many other parts of the world too, which is fused both with authoritarian and majoritarian ideas, seeks to preempt the articulation of economic grievances in the electoral space that might destabilize the incumbent government. The second reason, I think, why we might see a disconnect between livelihood concerns and voting behaviour may be related to how voters perceive the choices on offer. So voters may not see substantial differences between parties in their economic or their welfare policies. As I said earlier, welfare guarantees are now part of the offer made by most political parties. The lines between parties have also been deliberately blurred by the renaming or rebranding of older schemes, which have been introduced by a previous party and then adopted by the next party. So we've seen this with the PDS, we've seen this with the Awas Yojana, which moved from being the Indira Awas Yojana, named for Indira Gandhi, the former Congress Prime Minister, which is now called the PM, the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana. And any other number of schemes which have deliberately sought to blur the distinction between the welfare offer of different parties in the minds of voters. So I think this is one of the reasons why welfare may not be a determining factor in vote choice. A third reason, which has been emerging from other work that I've been doing looking at health, perceptions of health system performance in India and voting behaviour, relates to how performance voting operates in a multi-level or federal context. So we know from cross-national research that performance-based voting tends to be weaker in countries which have stronger multi-level governance. And this is because voters typically have more difficulty knowing which level of government is responsible for which policy, and therefore shaping their vote accordingly. In the last decade, we've seen increasingly centralised and personalised credit claiming for public goods provision by the Prime Minister at the national level, which has increasingly muddied the waters as to who is responsible for different policies, whether it's state governments or national governments. We have, alongside that centralised model of credit claiming, seen what I would describe as a process of blame deferral, whereby lower levels of government, local officials and opposition parties are blamed for corruption and inefficiency. So we've seen a centralisation of credit claiming and a localisation of blame. And so it could be that the BJP will see some of the upside from its welfare policies from those who have benefited from them or who are satisfied by them, while blame for poor performance on development issues is deferred to other corrupt politicians or officials at the state or local level. And as I say, this is what we've been finding, the work I've been doing with Oliver Heath and other colleagues on health and voting. This is exactly what we're finding. So people who are more satisfied with their experience of the health system are more likely to credit the so-called correct level of government, either the central or the state government, depending on the policy in question. Whereas those who are less satisfied are more likely to blame the local government, which is actually the tier of government with the least responsibility for health. So we say that this is a process by which discontent is being filtered out by being directed towards the local level. And I think in an election in which the BJP campaign has focused so heavily on painting the opposition as corrupt, if this kind of messaging sticks, as the BJP intends, it may serve both to redirect blame for economic distress away from the BJP, unsettling the idea that the BJP itself should be held responsible for problems such as unemployment and price rises, because the BJP is pursuing in earnest a vision for a more developed India, a Viksit Bharat, but its realization is being held back by other actors who are corrupt or anti-national. Corruption discourse, I think, also seeks to reduce the credibility of policy pledges made by opposition parties on the economy and the welfare, because it seeks to undermine the credibility of the opposition altogether. And its intention, I think, is deliberately to decenter these as issues on which people's vote will turn. So to conclude, and in response to the question we were posed here, I think Roti, Kapra and Makaan certainly do matter to voters, and they probably matter more so today than they mattered in 2019. But whether they will find expression in how people vote is much less clear.
Thank you, Luis. Very, also for being very, very precise on the timing and for a lot of food for thought. I am told that in addition to the chat function, the audience can also submit questions through the Q&A function. So again, I would invite anyone in the audience to think of questions for our speakers and put it either in the chat or in the Q&A functions. I would now give the floor to Professor Deshpande for her introductory remarks as well. Please, floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Diego, and thanks to the Institute of South Asian Studies. The organizers have suggested to me that I may speak on women voters and the issues of welfare. So I thought that I will offer some of my inputs to you initially, and then we can have more discussion on that. I think this conversation about women voters and welfare and also the issues of empowerment goes back to the 73rd and 74th Amendment. So I will briefly refer to that. And that was the moment when suddenly women were everywhere. And there was a lot of discussion about women's participation in politics, women's reservation, and the larger issues of their empowerment. They were raised by many people. So, and from that, if we cut to 2024, the current round of elections, once again, women are everywhere. With all the welfare schemes targeting women, and there have been a lot of sloganeering about women and their empowerment. And I did not present a list of all those schemes here because all of you have been reading about it. But there have been so many schemes like Ladli Behna, Lakpati Didi, Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao Andol, that kind of a mission. So there has been a lot of discussion again about women's mobilization. And I see these 3 decades, the journey of these 3 decades since 1990 to 2024, as the journey of shaping up of women's constituency in Indian politics. There have been efforts to mobilize women at several levels, and what kind of a women's constituency is shaping up during this period. To discuss it briefly, since we don't want to go into the details of the past so many years, this constituency has always been, there have been attempts to keep it non-political. And these attempts are not only on part of the ruling parties of a particular regime, but more generally also in the public discourse of the past 30 years. And to a certain extent, I have suggested earlier also that women's movement also contributed to that discourse, really, public discourse around women, which has kept the women's constituency deliberately on the margins of rough house of politics. And it is mainly considered as a non-political constituency, which can therefore be easily manipulated. That is the general idea with which we have operated. And it has also led to what we may call as a paradoxical kind of consensus in women's lives in India generally. And the paradoxical consensus is that, as you know, there has been overwhelming support about everything that is related to women. There has been a consensus, a politically correct kind of consensus on all those issues related to women, like, for example, reservations for women in the Lok Sabha and higher level political offices, or including the lower level political offices, or women's education, or even issues like triple talaq and women's liberation, so to say, in a certain context. So there has been generally a consensus among Indian people around that. But at the same time, this consensus turns out to be only tokenist or notional on various grounds, on various counts, and that creates a kind of paradox. And again, I need not explain that paradox um, right away in this conversation, but all of us are aware of that, that the consensus is punctured by several actions, several several decisions, policy decisions, as well as judicial decisions, and again the public discourse that shapes in India. It is punctured with this tokenism, certain type of tokenism, and um, uh, politically correct expressions about women's issues. Yes, particularly also about the violence against women. We would see the same kind of paradox and paradoxical consensus taking shape over the last so many years. I'm referring to this kind of a tokenism because, in a way, it flows into the current discussion of welfare and issues of welfare and women. It is with this same kind of tokenism or notional understanding, notional sort of guarantees of delivery that the welfare schemes for women, welfare programs for women, and the overall discussion about women's mobilization and women's empowerment takes place even in the current moment. So there is a kind of continuity which comes from the way in which Indian politics has discussed, so to say, the women's question. Often it is referred to as the women's question over the last so many decades. And now we come to the present moment, which again dates back, if you ask me, to 2016, around 2016, where for the first time this connection between welfare schemes for women and women voting in a particular way was identified and was discussed in the media. It was discussed in the political analysis and election analysis. Because you would recall, all of you would recall, that with the elections in Bihar, where for the first time women voted in a major way, and also with the coming up of various welfare schemes that the then Bihar government had announced for women, we started discussing this connection between women's welfare, their vote, and whether women enjoy a decisive, some kind of an agency in Indian politics in this new kind of politics, which electoral politics. It also emerged, this discussion also emerged in the context of the fact that at that time we see increase in women's turnout in several states after the 2016 elections. And that is where political analysts started discussing the possibility that women, because they are voting in large numbers and sometimes they outnumber men in certain states, they may actually decide the electoral outcome. And there have been some studies, and in my own work also I have tried to analyze this part of the puzzle, whether women could play a decisive role in the electoral outcomes. I'll come to that in a minute if time permits. But the point is that is where the story begins in 2016 assembly elections, and in the context of increasing turnout of women, the closing of the gender gap in turnout. And there were many media reports following these elections, and particularly the 2019 Lok Sabha elections. There were quite a few media reports that this decreased gender gap has contributed to a large extent in mobilizing women. And now also women have a certain kind of decisive power to decide the electoral outcome. Women's vote it can decide electoral outcome, especially in various assembly elections, but in 2019 also the Lok Sabha election outcome, because that was the first time when there was a connection between especially beneficiaries of the Ujjwala scheme, the newly launched Ujjwala scheme at that time, the cooking gas scheme, and how these beneficiaries of the Ujjwala scheme actually had preferred BJP as their electoral choice, and how they have voted for the BJP. And since Ujjwala Yojana or this scheme essentially targeted women, there is a certain kind of stereotypical understanding of women, obviously, reducing them to domesticity, but we will leave that for now. But it was assumed that since Ujjwala was targeted for women, women have voted for the BJP in large numbers. And so this what we have been talking about as the new welfare discourse, which really again takes the or follows the same kind of tokenist logic especially about women. This was well established. That connection was well established after 2019 elections to suggest that the BJP, the ruling party, benefited from women's vote. And yeah, this understanding, I think, was in sync with this the earlier what I discussed as the continuous kind of top-down agenda of women's empowerment, which essentially saw women as beneficiaries of the deliveries of the state, a kind of patriarchal and patrimonial state, and women were essentially seen as the beneficiaries of the state patronage. So that connection continued in 2019 elections, but some of the empirical studies that we conducted, and particularly what Luis referred to as the national election studies conducted by Lokniti, with the help of those studies, I was able to complicate this understanding a little bit. And I was able to complicate this understanding, easy connection between welfare schemes for women and women voting for a particular political party as an outcome of those welfare schemes does not hold true. And there again, I mean, we don't believe in nuances these days, especially in the field of elections, but generally, again, also in our public discourse. But if you try and understand the situation empirically, we will have to also tackle with certain nuances of statistics and of quantitative data, but also the macro level trends that may emerge from this data. So in other words, we have to take this with a huge pinch of salt as usual, because there are certain limitations to the understanding of the quantitative data. And at the same time, I could see three different trends that we may consider as important for our understanding of the relationship between women's vote and welfare. One, I mean, the NES has historically clearly established that in the earlier period, till the 1990s almost, the Congress party enjoyed certain kind of advantage among women. And this was mainly at the macro level. That is, if we take the all India level of analysis, this advantage, one could clearly see this advantage. But the Congress, it was neutralized, and sometimes it was reversed also as far as the state level analysis is concerned. So once you go to state level politics and Congress's vote in different states, even at that time, during the heydays of Congress or till the Congress decline, that time also, we don't see Congress enjoying clear-cut advantage among women in different states, because the state level contestations were very different, needless to say, in that multi-party competition scenario, especially in the 1990s. Now, in the last two elections, that is 2014 and 2019, we see that the Congress doesn't enjoy this obviously advantage among women. It is neutralized, and in the national level elections or all India level analysis, it is reversed also. So we don't see that trend happening anymore, and it can be related to several factors, but majorly decline of the Congress party in general in the Indian elections. Then in between, and especially between 2004 and 2009 or 2014 also, we can extend that period up to that, we see that women's vote is sort of engulfed. It remains confined within the caste and class identities. That is, women generally vote along with their men, in quotes, that is, men from that particular caste group or class group. So in other words, the caste and class identities remained more prominent in Indian politics during that period, rather than women's gendered identities in the pure sense of the term. So within the confines of caste and class. But in 2019, that's when it becomes very interesting. In spite of all this hype and in spite of the media reports regarding women voting for the BJP in large numbers, that is not the case at all India level. So BJP still very consistently, and this has remained a consistent trend since the 1990s, that BJP faces disadvantage among women voters. And more men than women vote for the BJP. And this has happened in spite of the analysis of the connection between Ujjwala scheme in particular, but other welfare schemes for women in general, and the BJP vote. So yes, if you look at the NES data, Ujjwala beneficiaries have voted for the BJP, but that does not mean that women have voted for the BJP, because among Ujjwala beneficiaries, you don't see overcrowding of women. And on the other hand, if you keep aside the Ujjwala beneficiaries for a minute, then if you look at the broader trends of gender-wise vote in the 2019 elections, there is a clear 3% gap as far as BJP's vote among women is concerned. So as far as the Congress vote is concerned, 19% men and 20% women have voted for the Congress in 2019. So there is a 1% positive gender gap advantage to Congress, but it is neutralized, as I said, once we go to the regional levels. But in case of BJP, there is a 3%, 39% of men and 36% of women have voted for the BJP. And this is a consistent gap that BJP has experienced since the 1990s. I won't go into the details right now. Then in order to sort of move further in the analysis, I have also checked this by controlling caste, class, and other type of variables to check whether gender-wise vote turns in favor of the BJP. But even after controlling all the social indicator variables, women do not tend to vote for the BJP. Now, there may be various explanations, but I will just mention two explanations. One, of course, is the fact that there are regional variations. And so we might see that in the state assembly elections in certain states, BJP gets gender advantage among women, and more women have voted for the BJP in certain state assemblies, and therefore in certain regions, even in the Lok Sabha elections. But more, again at the macro level, this trend still stands, and which begins in historically since the 1990s or even before that BJP remains a party of the privileged, more generally if we define the privilege, and women belong to the disprivileged classes. And so there is a dispersal of vote of these disprivileged classes in general, and therefore also of women in particular. And therefore women tend to vote more for the regional parties, if not for the Congress, but definitely not for the BJP. So I thought that this will be a good starting point and an interesting puzzle that we need to take ahead after the 2024 elections. If BJP, because of its welfare schemes targeted for women, and other political parties also targeting women on the basis of their welfare schemes, whether they are able to reverse this trend. And that is where perhaps we would be able to gauge whether welfare really matters for women, in terms of deciding whom to vote for. Yeah, so I will stop here for now.
Thank you, Rajesh Farid. That was really, really interesting, and I personally learned something new. I was part of those who made the easy assumption about women voting and welfare for women. Thanks a lot. Okay, I will just now turn to Professor Indrajit Roy for his introductory remarks, and then we go back to a general discussion. Indrajit, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Diego, and thank you, colleagues at the Institute of South Asian Studies. I'm very pleased to be here. I was asked to speak to issues of emotions in welfare, and I thought I'll see what ground I can cover. It's very helpful to have had these two excellent presentations before me, because that actually helps to, cover a lot of the political economy ground, if you will, so that one can talk about the softer, more sort of, less hard-hitting issues, as they're often called. Now, of course, welfare is standard fare on the menu of Indian politics, and Roti, Kapra, and Makaan make regular appearances in electoral politics. I think it was said already, the first time this this trifecta made its appearance was in the 1967 elections, and there was a 1974 film that was made on Roti, Kapra, Makaan, and they've sort of stayed. The Roti, Kapra, and Makaan have stayed as sort of shorthand for welfare since then, and you can see the enduring quality of welfare issues in terms of the emotional connect that politicians seek to make when they raise issues of whether they call it Roti, Kapra, or Makaan in those words, or they use other terms to refer to welfare that are in Hindi or other local languages. So there is, in addition to the actual sort of spread of resources or not, there is the question of emotional connect that welfare schemes and promises allow politicians to make. Now, the question before us has been framed in terms of whether welfare matters. And underpinning this question is a sort of dichotomy that's often introduced. And I'm not saying that's the intention here, but there's often a dichotomy that's introduced as to whether it's interests that matter or is it identities. With welfare sort of falling on the interest side of things. So, if we say welfare matters, it's because voters are interest driven. They are able to evaluate that, the government has provisioned them welfare. They're able to evaluate the quality of the welfare and then take decisions. If voters continue to vote for governments despite no welfare being delivered or the welfare being of poor quality, we assume that it's their identities that have trumped interests, that people have voted for government because of their, or the political parties because of their identity considerations. Now, of course, I'm drawing up, this is a bit schematic. It's, no actual analyst says this, but you get the broad contours of the debate here. What's important to bear in mind, of course, for this audience is that interests cannot be separated from identity. And welfare is giving us a really good example of how that dichotomy doesn't really exist, because of the way in which the identity of the Labharthi has been created out of welfare transfers in recent years. It's a term that's been increasingly used in a lot of the policy discussions, but also by the welfare dispensers themselves, to refer to a vast social group of people who are claimants to welfare and receive welfare. There is an element of political sort of supplication that is often assumed when we refer to the term Labharthi, and that's quite likely intended by those who used this term and those who sort of propagated this term. But the way the welfare receivers themselves may or may not internalize these ideas and these identities is always open to question. So just because the politicians may intend to see the welfare recipients as labharthis doesn't necessarily mean that people themselves, the welfare recipients themselves, see themselves as supplicants. They may not see themselves as full citizens, nagriks, but they certainly may not see themselves only as beneficiaries, which is what the term labharthi refers to. So that's, I think, something to bear in mind. And it's always an empirical question that draws on existing political struggles in different states, and perhaps adds a nuance to the question of whether welfare matters. Interests are shaped by identities. They are shaped by underlying emotions. And I think that's a point I'd like to return to when I talk a bit about what sorts of emotions may underpin welfare transfers, generically speaking. But before that, I wanted to actually indicate, pick up a data point from the CSDS, the Lokniti survey that has already been referred to earlier. As usual, always fascinating stuff. And I think what was really interesting for me was, one of the questions they asked is why the BJP-led NDA government should get another chance. And quite high on the reasons for which the respondents wanted to give the government another chance was welfare schemes. It seems 18% of all their respondents, thought that welfare schemes was a reason that the government should be given a second chance. And this was, of course, second to the top reason, which was good work. Now, of course, the moment you say good work, that's delightfully vague. But there is an evaluation already going on there of what is good in that sense. But why I thought welfare schemes, just this data point of welfare, was interesting because it's actually ahead of reasoning that Modi is a great leader. So it seems only 10% people believe the government should get another chance because of the Modi factor. Only 8% people believe the government should get another chance because of the construction of the Ram temple in Ayodhya. So they believe that it was a good thing that the temple was made, but that's not necessarily a reason that many of the Lokniti respondents would like the government to get back, to come back. So I think the point that was quite striking is that welfare is quite high on the list of the reasons that people that Loknitis, that the survey respondents have given for why the government should get another chance. Of course, equally interesting was the reasons that people gave for not electing the incumbent government. And almost a third of all respondents, and I think this is a point that has been made earlier, felt that increasing unemployment was a big blot on the government's record, and they should therefore not come back to power for that. Similarly, inflation was a close second, decreasing incomes were a third, and together these three sort of broadly political economy reasons, if you will, were almost 60% of the reasons that 60% of the people seem to prioritize these reasonings for not electing the government. So it's quite interesting, at least in terms of if you think of the survey results themselves, and this is a pre-poll survey, we know the limitations of the pre-poll survey, we know we can't really extrapolate a great deal from it, but I think it does seem to suggest that questions of welfare but questions also of the broader economy do seem to matter, and in fact they trump identity concerns of voters in a big way. So I just wanted to put that out there because it's useful to bear in mind the overarching sort of picture of what voters really want, or the principles on which voters say they will vote. Welfare, of course, has been promised by both the BJP and the Congress in their respective election manifestos. And undoubtedly, the other regional parties have also sort of made their own slew of promises around welfare. I think there have been a lot of studies which have referred to this, the new reach of welfare in India after 2014. And whether or not we agree with the motivations, the intentions, the fact is that it is a very elaborate set of schemes and benefits that have been instituted by the government, some reappropriated by earlier ones, some brand new. The quality of the services that are dispersed has always been uneven and patchy in the Indian context, and that story quite likely continues, with the exception perhaps that a lot of services, or at least the cash components of services, are now directly transferred into bank accounts. This was something that was already starting, as this audience will know, in the last days of the UPA, but seemed to have picked up steam in the last decade. And one sees that with the general cashlessness in the sort of everyday economy that has taken a lot of observers, both critics and supporters, by storm and by surprise. But what I really want to sort of caution everyone around all of these sort of discussions around welfare and the ways in which they are dispensed, and what often gets neglected, I suppose, is the issue of the emotions that underpin these welfare provisions. And any welfare scheme would generate, and is likely to generate, a range of emotional responses among the recipients. And I think the response to the question as to, does welfare matter, is perhaps mediated by the sorts of emotions that welfare schemes are able to generate or end up generating. What do I mean by this? So you could have a single transfer generating a great deal of joy as a specific emotion, the joy of that you're being cared for, that you've received a service, that you've been included within the ambit of the state, for instance, that you're recognized as a person who's deserving of welfare. You're recognized as a person who's deserving of state attention. And of course, the actual amount or the service or the product that you get is something that is fundamentally helpful. So you're overjoyed that you've got the certain sort of service. Another emotion that welfare services or welfare transfers could generate is the emotion of gratitude. So joy being just plain joy in receiving something, but gratitude, which comes with the feeling of being grateful towards those who are helping you. And here the language of the Labharti perhaps has its biggest sort of currency, because you are expected to be grateful, and you are grateful to Mr. Modi or whoever else it is locally who has sort of helped you get the program. Excuse me. And in some respects, I suppose the Modi ki guarantee is a way of is a way of sort of building off this assumption of welfare generating the emotion of gratitude. The emotion of gratitude could come with could accompany ideas that no one gave us anything in the past. This was the first time that we're receiving something, or that never was anything given to us without a bribe. And this is the first time that we're getting something without having to pay for it. And that could be a function of the mechanism, the direct sort of bank transfer, or it could be a function simply of the fact that you got lucky and there wasn't a middle person who was sort of wanting a bribe. And there could be, any number of those reasons that generates gratitude for, in response to the welfare measure that you've received. A third emotion that underpins welfare is the emotion of hope. The idea that you've got something, it's not a lot, but it's something that can help you invest and make a better future for yourself and for your children or, your family more broadly, which could help them in the future. And here, of course, the idea of hope links to the idea that you're receiving welfare today, hopefully so that your folks and future generations don't have to depend on welfare tomorrow. These were narratives that I'd heard back in the day when I used to work with people who had just received work under the employment guarantee scheme. We want to work hard today, or we're willing to work hard today under an otherwise thankless scheme so that our children don't have to do the same thing tomorrow. So there is that notion of hope that's extremely powerful, which underpins the welfare transfer. Now, each of these emotions that I've mentioned so far are what you might call positive emotions. But welfare also is often underpinned by negative emotions, especially when welfare is badly delivered, or is delivered or comes with strings attached, or simply doesn't come at all. A promise is made, but it's never fulfilled. There is the emotion of shame that, at least in the West, is often associated with welfare, but also something that you find a great deal among many respondents across India, many rural as well as urban folk across India, where there's no shame generally attached to receiving welfare, but the shame comes with, are you still relying on welfare? Why don't you go work hard, or why don't you do something that sort of makes you less reliant on welfare? And this is the attitude that you often hear locally dominant groups, locally dominant individuals trying to sort of run down welfare recipients with. Again, the extent to which ideas of shame are actually sort of internalized by welfare recipients themselves has always been open to question in the Indian context, simply because politically the narrative of welfare is quite strong. But you might remember Mr. Modi taunting the NREGA back in 2015, saying, why would I stop a program that showed up the failure of the previous government so spectacularly? So there was the element of taunting the NREGA and its beneficiaries in there as well. But as has been said, the present government, much as it may be taunting this or that element of welfare, has by and large preserved the welfare transfers and in fact even extended them. But the element of shame can play up in other ways as well. Some of you may remember the campaign back in 2014, when the Congress party used to proudly claim that they had lifted people out of poverty. But their hand gestures were such, when they talked about literally lifting people up from poverty, that, annoyed a whole lot of actual poor people who said this was no way to really talk about poverty reduction and, the way in which welfare has helped or not. So there are elements of shame that may intentionally or unintentionally sort of underpin welfare, and it's therefore important to be careful, especially for politicians who may want to leverage welfare for their political sort of gains. And this links quite closely to anger also, the way in which anger could be a very powerful sort of emotion that comes with associations of welfare that could be made by political leaders who would, either run down others in having delivered welfare badly, or play up their own delivery of welfare, but in ways that anger people because it's not done in a way that accords with people's dignity. I think it's it's often assumed that welfare is all people are looking for. And I think it's important, given the political language in many states across India, to recognize that for voters, it's not just the welfare transfer itself that matters, but the way it's presented and the language, the political narrative around it. Especially because there are several states where the language of dignity, whether anchored in class mobilizations or anti-caste movements or language pride, or any of those other sorts of broader political struggles, the language of dignity is quite powerful, and it's an idea that many people including in rural areas, are very attached to. And therefore, if ideas about welfare or programs about welfare, beautifully run welfare programs perhaps, but if they're not associated with the right sorts of sort of language of dignity, then they run the risk of angering and annoying people. And I think sometimes political parties are simply puzzled by, they ran all the world's largest political welfare programs. They talked it up, but why didn't they win elections? Because, of course, when you run welfare programs and talk it up, but don't do it in ways that recognize people's dignity, then you're alienating rather than appealing to voters. And the final emotional element that I just want to sort of bring here, it's not something I've seen play up very much in the Indian in welfare programs, but it's something just to be aware of, is an over-reliance on welfare feeds the fear that welfare programs are here to stay, and in a way undermines the idea of hope. People are sort of taking on welfare programs so that future generations don't have to take on welfare programs. But if there's a idea that welfare programs are here to stay, and not just us, but several generations down the line will have to rely on welfare, there's a fear that welfare transfers generate, that we are now going to, this is the future, and this is not the future we want. As I said, I've not seen that a great deal, because I think there remains a great sense that social welfare schemes are a way out of poverty, that future generations will not really have to rely on welfare, that investments in education, enterprising sort of approaches to small businesses will pull people out of reliance on others. But that element of fear is something to bear in mind when we think about welfare in emotional terms. And I think I just want to close with sort of bringing all of this together in a broader context, where we see welfare in India, welfare provision in a context where welfare provision is highly personalized. So whether it's the central government or whether it's state governments, welfare programs are quite linked with the personalities of politicians, of chief ministers or prime ministers, and that adds to the levels of emotional connect that welfare programs make. I think there's also important to bear in mind the broader context of widening inequality that has already been mentioned, but also, and this is not surprising to economists, reduction of poverty. Now, we could debate the extent to which poverty has reduced, whether it has reduced at all or not, but whether you look at World Bank statistics or whether you look at what's called multi-dimensional poverty indicators, there is some indication that despite the awfulness of the last few years, poverty seems to have reduced from 2011 to 20 back in 2022 or whenever the data has been recently sort of collected. And I think this is interesting because the 2024 elections will be interesting in terms of, just giving a sense as to what people prioritize. Because for some, the fact that you've seen a reduction in poverty means that you've seen an improvement in your own life chances and life opportunities over the last 20 years. And I might say I'm willing to tolerate other people doing much better than me because I've at least seen an improvement in my own life chance. But that is not something that governments can take for granted, because I might tolerate that today. The next generation may not tolerate that and say, yeah, we've seen our improvements, but how is it that some people are improving always better than we are? And I think that's the question that sort of really that's when things become explosive. I'm not suggesting that Indians have a necessarily high tolerance for inequality. Perhaps they do, perhaps they don't, we don't know. But if high inequality or widening inequalities comes with a general reduction of poverty over the last couple of decades, it may not be surprising that Indians are quite sort of willing to tolerate it for the time being. And it's always contingent. These things are always contingent, given the emotional elements of the welfare transfers that are helping them reduce poverty. I also want to be very clear that the poverty reduction story is not a story that the NDA can claim sole credit for. We've been seeing a successive reduction of poverty since 2004, since the UPA days, and it may well be that it's a continuation of that trend. But I think I'll close there by saying that emotions, I think, may help to respond to the question of how and why welfare matters, beyond a simple response that yes, welfare matters. I hope that helps. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Indrajit. I will now ask a brief question to each of you, while people in the audience might formulate their own questions and put it in the Q&A function or in the chat box. I will go in reverse order to connect with what Indrajit just said, and I personally think emotions are extremely important, if not the number one determinant of a person's behavior in general. And so it's not really clear why shouldn't also determine political behavior. I myself, I am a political scientist. I am supposed to vote rationally, and I would never vote for the present government of Italy, for example, no matter what they do, no matter how spectacular their performance is, no matter the number of benefits they give me, because I viscerally dislike them. So it's an emotional response, and we get emotional responses, how we behave at our jobs, the people we relate with. It's really, we know from psychologists that that's really a key driver of our behavior. And this is especially true for younger people. And there are a lot of young people in India, so it's even more important, even if you take aside the cultural context of countries like Italy probably, or India, to stereotypize a little bit, but where maybe emotions are more important than in other contexts. Anyway, my question for you, Indrajit, is that to me, one of the key elements of the Modi package is that he really built on hope. And in a way, to simplify a bit, that many voters think that Modi is the best hope for the country to actually become a lot more prosperous. And that makes it somehow completely disconnected to the actual performance in office, but up to a point, because at a certain point, there would be, okay, it didn't work. But for that to happen, you have to have somebody else who take that hope forward and see, okay, this other guy or this other person, this other woman, will take us forward. What do you think about the role of hope, not just for welfare, but as a general determinant of electoral behavior? And for Rajaswari, I have a question more specific on a policy, which I think it's not really being discussed much, which is the quotas for women in parliament and legislative assemblies. Of course, many sees it as a self-goal, own goal, because, yes, we're doing it, but not really doing it for a while. But do you think that matters? For women, or is just electorally speaking, or is just something to think about more down the line? Luis, I thought your point about the centralization of credit and localization of blame is really interesting, but I wonder how much of this effect is mediated through the current state of democracy and the current state of the media landscape, or could it be any different given how things are in the diffusion of informations about pretty much everything in India? Floor is yours. If you could keep your answer to your very brief comments, and you're also welcome to raise points from the other presentations if you like, but try to keep it to 5 minutes or less.
Sure. Can I respond very quickly to your question, Diego? Because it's I think you're spot on. Emotions matter, of course, and it's the summons, the meat of elections as well. I think one reason that people are a little wary of sort of emphasizing or talking too much about emotions, of course, part of it is, the quantitative turn in the social sciences has meant that it gets notoriously difficult to measure them, to quantify them, although our psychologist colleagues, sort of help us do that all the time. But I think there's still questions of measurement which might sort of worry people. And but that doesn't mean you can't study emotions qualitatively. Of course you can. And I think that's where political ethnography and political anthropologists can help in sort of responding to some of the questions that you've mentioned. I do think that there is a sense also, however, of being a little careful about sort of talking too much about emotions, because then there's the risk of painting a society as an emotional society. Indians are an emotional people, for instance, plays into lots of Orientalist tropes, which I think people would like to avoid. But of course, you're right. I mean, hopes and emotions more broadly are universal political currencies, right? The Italians, the Greeks, the Brits. I mean, think Brexit, and there was what was rational about any of that happened, for instance. So I do think there's a need to have more universally comparable works on political emotions that don't sort of downplay the role of emotions, or say that people who are emotional are somehow less political or are not worthy of sort of taking part in politics, while recognizing, of course, that some emotions are handy to right-wing ideas, others are less handy to, and there are ways in which emotions can be used and abused. In a way that ideas of hope have, of course, been quite central to the promise of Modi, and certainly the 2014 campaign around Achhe Din was all around, promising hope. And it was a very strange time, I think, for India in terms of its political economy. The Indian economy was actually doing well comparatively. I mean, yes, our rates of growth had sort of slowed down, but we're talking about a 6% growth rate in 2011-12. That was, that was not too bad if you look globally, if you look across the global sort of rates of growth, but it was much slower than what many Indians were used to. And I suppose Modi was able to capitalize on those on the fears of slowdown in growth, but also the hunger for more economic growth among certain privileged groups that I think have already been discussed, whose support for the BJP has already been discussed. But there was definitely a sense of Modi in 2014 breaching a caste class barriers that the BJP usually has had and reaching across to new constituencies and at least offering us the possibility that he would magically improve things for India. And it is our version of Make India Great Again sort of idea that really comes through. There's definitely the Hindu first policy that appealed to many people who believe that Hinduism was being sort of marginalized or pushed out of the mainstream of Indian political culture. And I think Modi was able to capitalize more than on hope, on fears that things were somehow sort of collapsing, and that that he was the only one who could prevent a total collapse. Now, hope and fear do make strange bedfellows, but I think it's important to disentangle the sort of narratives, the underlying narratives. And a lot of 2014, although there was Achhe Din and the promise of good days, a lot of it was also about how there were certain communities or people who were sort of becoming powerful under the Congress party, and how Muhammad would take away the reservations from Mukesh, which is something that Amit Shah was famously known to have said in Uttar Pradesh. So I think there's the element of fear was something that really went hand in hand with a lot of the narratives in 2014, which of course gets you to think about how important a study of emotions more broadly really is. So I'll stop there, but thanks for that question, Diego.
To you.
Yes. In fact, I would say that this question about and the debate about women's reservation policy, quotas for women, was the perfect example of the kind of paradoxical consensus that I was talking about, because it continued the debate, and it died also. It began in 1984 and then it continued for a long time. And throughout this entire period, everybody really appreciated the idea, as I said, including the women's movement, without taking into consideration the political nuances which are involved in this debate. Like, for example, the women's movement couldn't appreciate the idea that there should be separate quotas for this demand for Dalit and OBC women. And they simply refused to agree to that idea. So at one point of time, we know that there was a kind of strange alliance on the steps of the parliament, where the women leaders from right-wing political parties and left-wing political parties and autonomous women's movement were sitting together. So that kind of a strange alliance also happened because of this strange political consensus around women's issues. And since you asked that what it implies for women voters, and I had missed that point earlier, so thanks for that. I'm suggesting that the women's reservations really politically don't matter in that sense of the term, because political parties always have this choice to give candidatures to more women. I mean, nobody stops them with the reservation or formal quota or without formal quota. But that has not happened, and that's the paradox about this consensus. But as far as women voters are concerned, I'm suggesting that perhaps there was this top-down narrative about women's empowerment, which begins with the debate on women's quota. And there is a counter narrative which is emerging in Indian politics, which is like a bottoms-up narrative, where women, in a way, ultimately, at the macro level at least, operate as a certain kind of decisive constituency. And that was evident in 2019, that despite what was expected from women, that they would accept their role as labharthis and as beneficiaries of welfare schemes. In fact, they have voted as a result of various combination of factors. They have voted slightly differently than men, and this is a very decisive trend. So perhaps against our expectations, there is a counter narrative emerging, which we need to check in 2024 elections. So I'm not sure it was a direct answer to your question, but I also wanted to make my point, which I had missed earlier, about relating it to 2024. Yeah.
Thank you, Rajeshwari. And Luis, there is also a variation of my question to you from the audience, which is whether Modi has changed the way in which voters attribute credit for welfare scheme, whether to the central or the state government, or whether the Modi government has changed this, in your opinion.
Thanks, Diego. And I thought, if it's okay, I might just tackle the question in the Q&A as well, which is about whether welfare schemes run the risk of making people lazy or disinclined to work, which is such an important question when one thinks about the welfare state. So I can't help be provoked to respond to that, if you don't mind. But yeah, so yes, in response to the question, Modi has absolutely changed the way that credit is claimed for welfare policies. We saw, and in work with Rajeshwari as well and KK Kailash, we've looked quite closely at the NES data on this. And we can see over the, comparing the UPA to the NDA era, that there's been a very pronounced centralization of credit attribution by voters. So stylized model under the UPA government between 2004 to 2014, we saw lots of new centrally sponsored welfare schemes, but a landscape in which state-level governments were able to take credit even for schemes that were being primarily funded by the national government. So, think of big programs like National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. Many state governments were actually able to brand this as a state-level welfare scheme, and voters attributed credit in part also to state governments as well as the central government. That landscape has changed very substantially since 2014, when we've seen a prime minister who's much more inclined to aggressively claim credit. So the strong personalization and branding of welfare schemes, the Modi Ki Guarantee, the use of Modi's image on everything from Ujjwala gas cylinders, all of the advertising around welfare programs, food rations, and so on are heavily personalized, either presented as direct gifts from the prime minister or from a chief minister. And we see opposition chief ministers playing the same, using the same kind of playbook at the state level as well. So yes, very substantial centralization of credit claiming. Diego, in response to your question, yes, I suppose in part this is a consequence of the way that a different media landscape has evolved. So we have higher levels of concentration within the media, a more leader-centric portrayal of politics, which Modi has honed, but the media have played their part as well in creating that kind of leader-centric, more presidential style of political campaigns. So I see these two things being symbiotic rather than one causing the other. And of course, the digitization of the welfare landscape has also enabled and been supported by that process of the centralization of credit claiming. It's now much easier to present a welfare transfer as being a direct gift from the Prime Minister to an individual beneficiary who might be receiving that benefit directly into their bank account, rather than being transmitted through multiple layers of the state. And one of the things we've also seen is the Prime Minister's office seeking very deliberately to bypass state governments as the intermediate layer of administration for many of these schemes. They can't do it for all schemes, but many of the newer schemes have been designed in a way that can bypass that state level of administration. So in many ways, I think there's been a pronounced centralization of credit claiming. We don't see it for all schemes. And in fact, in a paper that Rajeshwari KK Kailash and I published after 2019, we actually see still interesting, and it'll be interesting to see whether this has shifted in 2024, but we do see that voters distinguish between different types of schemes. So there are still some welfare schemes, and in 2019, PDS and pensions in particular, that were more likely to be attributed to state governments. I think it would be I imagine on the PDS, we might see that to shifted in by 2024. I also found that in the work on health as well with Oliver Heath that I've been doing, that voters are actually more able than you might imagine to determine which level of government is responsible for different schemes. So for the running of hospitals versus health insurance versus who runs immunization programs. So it's not clear, it's not that everything has been centralized, but certain, that's clearly been the direction of travel. But to respond to the other question about whether there's a risk that welfare schemes make people lazy or disinclined to work, one thing I wanted to say, because there's always a risk with this kind of a conversation that we paint the picture that India has a very generous welfare state. That's not the case. So, just to give you a sense of that, if you're not intimately familiar with the kinds of welfare schemes that are in operation, India has very, very minimal state pensions. Most people who work in the informal sector have barely anything by way of pension. There's no unemployment insurance scheme for anyone, whether you work in the organised sector or in the informal sector. There's no paid sick leave if you're in the informal sector. There are very limited maternity benefits for anyone outside of the organised sector, and the organised sector accounts for less than 8% of the working population. So, kind of any of the kinds of insurance models that you might think might serve as a disincentive to work don't exist in India. What we have are the proliferation, and we should also be careful about talking about a proliferation. There has been no marked increase in welfare expenditure under the BJP government since 2014. What we haven't seen is a contraction. So there's been stability in the level of welfare spending. In fact, if you're interested in this, Rita Kakara and a co-author have a new article that just came out, was published yesterday in The Hindu, which tracks welfare spending on different kinds of schemes under the BJP. And they show, and other people have shown this too, that there is no marked increase, but rather there's relative stability in welfare spending. So there's been no massive expansion of the welfare state. There's certainly been no expansion of things that might serve as a disincentive to work. What we've seen is the use of a whole host of subsidy schemes and direct benefit transfers that effectively top up people's incomes who are surviving on fairly precarious wages in the informal sector, and provide direct subsidies to groups of people such as farmers in sectors which are quite distressed. So this has been, I'm just finished a book which will come out later this year on the long history of India's welfare state. And this has been the story throughout, that welfare has always been constructed in order to incentivize people to work. In fact, enshrining a duty to work rather than designing a welfare state that is organized around providing a right to work or modes of insurance when people aren't able to work. So I'll stop my response there, but thank you.
Thank you. And I would invite Rajeshwari and Luis. There are questions for you in the Q&A. If you could give a very brief response to that. But I also want to say that I agree with everything Luis just said about this connection between welfare and laziness. But there is the fear that this mechanism actually exists is something very present all over. And it's a strange kind of thing because on the one hand, many of the BJP supporters say that one of the reasons why they don't like the Congress is because they would make, give soaps and benefits to people and make them lazy. Whereas, as you said, there isn't really any difference in terms of spending, at least in the welfare. So it's, again, something that probably people choose who they like, and then they rationalize why they do. Anyway, Rajeshwari and Luis, very briefly and to the points raised by the audience, and then we will have to wrap up.
You want me to go first?
Yes, please.
Okay, thanks, Pratim, for that question. And as I said, the dominant understanding about women and their connect to welfare is that perhaps it will be possible to mobilize them on the margins of politics through the welfare policies. And so it still remains a dominant sort of understanding. But the real question is that whether in 2024, the way in which women would vote, whether it changes or it is at least very discreetly, it is able to change this understanding about their agency. So let us wait and see. And 2024 presents an interesting moment for us to develop that understanding. That would be my answer.
Thank you. Luis, to you.
So yeah, the question was whether health has been pushed effectively into subnational political arenas, given its relative absence in the national arena. I would say very patchily. So there are a handful of states in which health has been politically mobilized. Rajasthan is probably the most interesting, and the only state, for instance, which has passed its own Right to Health Act under the previous Chief Minister Ashok Gehlot. And to some extent, other states such as Tamil Nadu and Kerala, which have a somewhat more robust public health system. But I would say that health on the whole has been curiously marginal to electoral politics, despite, as you say, the fairly catastrophic handling of the second wave of COVID. And that partly probably reflects the fact that all political actors felt implicated in that handling. So I think it was very difficult for them probably to point the finger of blame very effectively at another level of government. It also reflects the fact that health is a much more challenging policy landscape to offer quick welfare pledge type promises as compared to the other forms of welfare transfers that we've been talking about today, which have been much more central to electoral politics. I could give a much longer answer on this, but I'm really conscious that we're over time, so I think I'll leave it there. But it's a really important question, and it's one that's motivating our work on health and voting.
Okay, thank you, Luis. Thank you to all of you, the speakers, and to all of you in the public for listening. We are wrapping up. Let me just remind you that on the 7th of May at 11 a.m., there is the new episode, if you like, of this webinar series on the impact of the media on the 2024 Indian elections. Let me thank you once again, and see you soon on these screens. Bye-bye.
Bye, thanks.
Thank you. Bye.